My dear child, something unfolded last night that no one in that room was prepared for. The stillness that followed felt heavier than anything ever said aloud, as if the air itself had thickened with meaning. What began as an ordinary gathering, full of light conversation and casual exchange, shifted the moment your person went quiet. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but then it became impossible to ignore. They lowered their gaze and seemed to get lost inside a thought they had been carrying for far too long. It wasn't new. It was something buried, something repeatedly pushed aside, something they had trained themselves to avoid. Yet in that moment, it surfaced. Their friends caught it immediately. The change in posture, the pause in speech, the expression that didn't quite match the energy they had been showing all evening. It looked like someone standing right at the threshold of a confession they could no longer outrun. One of their friends finally broke the silence, gently asking if everything was all right. But no response came right away. The room itself seemed to slow down, as if even sound had decided to retreat. What was happening internally was louder than anything external. There was a visible struggle between fear and truth, between holding on and finally letting something out into the open. For a long time, your person had been carrying feelings they never allowed themselves to name. They acted unchanged. They behaved as though nothing had shifted inside them. They tried to convince others, and maybe even themselves, that your presence no longer had any influence over their thoughts. But deep down, that was never the reality they were living. Eventually, in a voice softer than anyone expected, they admitted they were ready to be honest, and the moment those words left them, the atmosphere changed completely. Their friends immediately understood this wasn't casual talk. This was something built up over time, something resisted repeatedly, something that had been sitting behind pride, confusion, and avoidance. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might stop again. They leaned back, took a slow breath, as though gathering strength from somewhere unseen. But this time, they didn't retreat. Once truth starts rising, it becomes harder to suppress it than to speak it. They confessed that every attempt to move on had eventually circled them back to the same inner place. Every distraction lost its effect. Every effort to replace the memory only made it echo louder. No matter how much time passed or how far they tried to go emotionally, one presence kept returning in their mind: you, your energy, the imprint you left behind. They said they once believed time would naturally dissolve everything, that distance would soften it into nothing. Instead, time did the opposite. It clarified what they had been trying not to see. One of their closest friends reacted with visible shock, because this version of them was unfamiliar. Until that night, they had always appeared composed, certain, even unaffected. When questioned in the past, they gave half explanations, controlled answers, carefully chosen words that kept the real story hidden. But that night, there was no more space for performance. They admitted that some nights had become heavier than they ever revealed. Thoughts they never intended to revisit would return without permission. Memories they believed were buried would surface with unexpected clarity. Even the smallest reminders in daily life began to point back to what they thought they had left behind. Then someone asked the question that shifted everything further. Why now? The answer didn't come immediately. It formed slowly, like something finally breaking through resistance. Because silence had started to feel heavier than honesty. Because pretending required more energy than truth. Because they realized that feelings don't disappear just because they are ignored long enough. As they continued speaking, the emotional weight in the room deepened. They explained how your memory had been appearing in ordinary moments without warning, quiet evenings, random afternoons, unrelated conversations. There was no control over it. It simply happened. And every time it did, it brought the same realization. What they had tried to bury was still alive within them. At one point, someone tried to interrupt, but they kept going, almost urgently, as if stopping would mean losing the courage to continue. They admitted that while others seemed to move forward with ease, something in them remained unfinished, something unresolved, something they had never fully understood or defined. Then came a truth that silenced everyone completely. They said they were afraid that by the time they finally understood what they truly felt, the chance to express it might already be gone. The energy in the room shifted instantly. This was no longer simple reflection. This was regret beginning to surface in real time. When asked directly if they had ever truly let go, there was no hesitation in their answer. None at all. Just certainty. They had not let go, not in the way they had pretended to. That admission carried more weight than anything said before it. It exposed everything they had been avoiding, the distance they created, the silence they maintained, the belief that avoidance would eventually erase emotion. Instead, the opposite happened. The more they suppressed it, the more defined it became. Details returned, conversations, moments, small gestures, fragments no one else would think were important. Yet they remained vivid in their mind when everything else faded. Then they revealed something even more vulnerable. There had been moments when they almost reached out, times when they typed messages and never sent them, times when their finger hovered over the decision to reconnect, but fear pulled them back. No one in that room had realized how long this internal conflict had been continuing, and still, the deepest truth had not yet fully surfaced. After another pause, they finally admitted what had been weighing underneath everything else. They no longer knew whether their silence had protected them from pain or quietly cost them something they might never be able to recover again. The room fell into silence again. No one rushed to respond because everyone could feel the weight of what had just been said. There are moments when understanding arrives so clearly that words feel unnecessary. Something had already shifted in them, and everyone could sense it. That was what made last night different from anything that came before. It was no longer just an emotional outpouring or a passing confession. It had become something deeper, an honest unfolding of what had been hidden for far too long. After a long period of avoidance, one of their friends finally asked the question that lingered in everyone's mind. If the chance appeared right now, what would you say? Your person turned their face slightly away. For a brief moment, a quiet expression crossed them, something between softness and regret, almost like a memory touching them from the inside. Then they admitted, without dressing it up, that those words should have been spoken much earlier in time. Again, silence returned, but this time it felt entirely different. It was no longer awkward or uncertain. It felt like understanding had finally entered the room. Something that had been sealed for too long was now open, even if only partially. Most expected the conversation to end there, but it didn't. Instead, your person continued. And in that continuation, something had clearly shifted. Pride was no longer steering the words. They spoke more openly, more honestly, without the filters they once relied on. They admitted that for years they had tried to make sense of their emotions through reasoning alone. They searched for explanations. They built logical stories around feelings that were never truly logical to begin with. They told themselves versions of reality that sounded acceptable, even comforting. But none of those explanations ever matched what was actually happening inside them. The truth, when they finally allowed themselves to face it, was far simpler and far harder than they had been willing to accept. No matter how far they tried to move forward, something within them kept returning to the same unresolved place. The same feeling, the same memory, the same presence, the same connection they had tried so long to define and dismiss at the same time. And for the first time, they stopped resisting it. For the first time, they stayed with it instead of escaping it. For the first time, they accepted that some emotions don't vanish simply because they are ignored. Sometimes they remain because they were never fully understood in the first place. And that realization changed everything for them. It wasn't just that the feeling had survived. It was that they had survived it, despite everything they had done to suppress it, despite time, despite distance, despite silence, despite pride. The truth remained intact, and now it had finally been spoken out loud, without distortion. The room felt different after that, heavier but clearer. One friend leaned forward and asked carefully if these feelings had become stronger recently. Your person didn't respond immediately. They took their time, as if searching for a way to express something that couldn't easily be measured. Then they nodded. It was a small movement, but it carried more weight than a long explanation ever could. Everyone understood immediately. This wasn't something fading. This wasn't something random or temporary. This was something that had been growing quietly in the background all along, unnoticed even by those closest to them, and then came what deepened the entire conversation even further. They admitted that lately memories had begun returning on their own, not summoned, not chased, just arriving unexpectedly in ordinary moments, certain words, specific expressions, small interactions that once seemed insignificant but now felt impossible to forget. Even they were surprised by how clearly those moments resurfaced, as if time had not erased them at all. It wasn't something they had been looking for. It wasn't something they had invited back. It simply kept returning. A friend then asked if they had ever truly believed it was over. A faint expression appeared on their face, not joy, not relief, but recognition. The kind that comes when someone realizes they have been telling themselves a story for a long time. They admitted that yes, they had tried to convince themselves it was finished. That enough time had passed. That silence meant closure. That moving forward meant letting go. But none of those beliefs ever fully held. Every time they tried to settle into that idea, something small would break through, a memory, a feeling, a thought they didn't expect. And suddenly, everything they thought was resolved felt open again. The room grew quieter. Even breathing felt slower. Then came another confession, one that shifted everything once more. Your person admitted that recently they had started noticing something they could no longer ignore. Even with new people in their life, even with distractions, even with routine and busyness filling the space, nothing carried the same emotional weight. Nothing reached the same depth. Nothing created the same internal reaction. That realization changed the atmosphere completely. Because now, this was no longer only about memory. It was about comparison, about recognition, about finally seeing what had been present all along. One friend finally asked directly what everyone was thinking, whether these feelings had truly never disappeared. Your person looked ahead without hesitation this time. There was no confusion in their expression, no attempt to soften the truth. They admitted that while they may have stopped expressing it outwardly, they had never stopped carrying it inwardly. And that was enough to settle the room into complete silence. Then a quieter voice asked why they had hidden it for so long if it was still there. The answer came more slowly this time, each word carrying more weight than the last. They explained that sometimes people hide what they feel because speaking it turns it into something real. And once something becomes real, it demands action. It forces clarity. It forces decisions. It removes the safety of distance. And that is what they had been avoiding all along. The room stayed still. Everyone understood that this wasn't avoidance for no reason. It was avoidance born from fear of consequence. Then another confession followed. They admitted there had been moments recently when they almost reached out, almost sent a message, almost broke the silence. But something always stopped them, not lack of feeling, not lack of care, but uncertainty about timing. Uncertainty about whether they still had the right to reopen something that had been left untouched for so long. That uncertainty kept them frozen between intention and inaction. Then came something deeper. They realized that emotions don't always disappear. Sometimes they simply stop asking to be noticed. They quiet down. They retreat into the background. But they don't necessarily end. They wait. And sometimes all it takes is one unexpected moment for everything to rise again. And for them, that night had become that moment. When asked if those feelings still mattered, their answer came instantly. If they didn't matter, they wouldn't still be thinking about what was never said. They wouldn't still be questioning what could have been done differently. They wouldn't still be carrying the weight of unfinished words. That realization lingered long after it was spoken. Then, unexpectedly, they revealed something they had never said before, not even to those closest to them. There had been moments when they imagined the possibility of it being too late. Moments when they wondered whether silence had already changed too much. Moments when they feared that hesitation might have become permanent loss. The room didn't interrupt. No one needed to. And then came the final shift of that part of the conversation. One friend asked what they would do if another chance still existed. The question seemed simple, but it landed deeply. Your person lowered their gaze, took a long breath, let the silence sit fully before answering. Then they admitted that if another chance truly appeared, they would no longer pretend there was nothing left unsaid. And with that, something subtle but undeniable changed. The past was still there, but so was possibility. Everyone in the room understood the difference immediately. This wasn't the end of a feeling. It was the beginning of finally facing it. The reminder had arrived without any warning, yet it landed with a force they weren't prepared for. In an instant, it pulled back everything they had been trying to keep quiet inside themselves. It disrupted the story they had been telling themselves, that they had already moved on, that they had already closed that chapter, that it no longer had the same influence over them. But in that moment, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could something be called over if a single ordinary reminder could still shift their entire emotional state? How could they describe it as the past if it still had the ability to change the present so easily? That question lingered, refusing to leave, and the more they sat with it, the harder it became to continue pretending otherwise. Their friends noticed the shift in how they were speaking. The tone was no longer just reflective, it was becoming clearer, more grounded, like understanding was forming in real time rather than being recalled from memory. Then one of them gently asked whether these feelings were present every single day. Your person paused, considering the weight of the question carefully before answering. They admitted it wasn't every day. Life still moved forward. Work, responsibilities, distractions, they all filled space and sometimes gave the illusion of distance. There were stretches of time when it didn't feel loud or overwhelming, but it returned often enough that it could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Often enough that it could no longer be ignored. Often enough that denial itself started to feel dishonest. And with that, they admitted something they had been avoiding for a long time. Whatever they felt had never fully left. That statement changed the atmosphere instantly. Because there is a clear difference between remembering something occasionally and realizing it keeps returning more than you ever expected. One is memory, the other is presence. The room felt heavier now, but also clearer. Understanding was replacing confusion. And then came what they said next. They admitted that even in ordinary moments, laughing with others, talking, being present outwardly, there were times when part of their attention drifted inward. Not obviously, not dramatically, but quietly, subtly, almost without permission. And in those moments, comparisons would form. Not forced comparisons, but natural ones. Feelings compared to feelings. Connections compared to connections. Experiences compared to something they had once felt but never fully processed. And every comparison, without exception, led back to the same unresolved place they had been avoiding, a place that never truly felt closed. Then they revealed something even more personal. There had been nights when clarity almost arrived on its own. Moments when everything felt close to being understood. Moments when they stood at the edge of acceptance. But each time they stepped back from it, because accepting it fully meant acknowledging something they had tried hard not to face, that it had never really left them. That realization carried a heavier weight than anything they had said so far. One friend finally asked if they were afraid of what all of this meant. The answer came without delay. Yes, but not because of the feeling itself, because fully accepting it would remove every remaining excuse. No more distance to hide behind. No more uncertainty to soften the truth. No more stories that made it easier to avoid responsibility for what still existed inside them. Everything would become real, and reality, once acknowledged, could no longer be ignored. The room went quiet again, this time with a deeper kind of understanding. They went on to say that they had often heard advice from others about moving on, about letting go, about focusing forward. Some of it made sense logically, some of it sounded strong and practical, but none of it reached the part of them that still felt unfinished. Because advice can guide behavior, but it cannot erase emotional residue that hasn't been resolved. Then came another question. What was the hardest thing to admit in all of this? There was no hesitation this time. The hardest truth was realizing how long they had been living as if nothing affected them. How long they had maintained the appearance of being unaffected while internally still carrying something unresolved. They had waited for clarity to arrive naturally. They had hoped time would settle everything on its own. They had assumed distance would eventually turn emotion into memory. But it never happened that way. Clarity didn't arrive gently. It arrived all at once, in that room, through their own voice, through words they had avoided for too long. And once it did, everything shifted. Then something unexpected happened. One of the quieter friends who had mostly been listening finally spoke with simple honesty. They suggested that maybe this feeling had existed far longer than your person had allowed themselves to accept. No argument followed, no correction, no resistance, just silence. Because in that moment, it didn't feel like speculation. It felt like recognition. Your person took a slow breath, and instead of denying it, they admitted something deeper. Maybe they had known for a long time. Maybe the real struggle was never discovering the truth. Maybe it was finally allowing themselves to say it out loud, because speaking it made it real. And once something becomes real, it can no longer be pushed aside as easily as before. That understanding settled over the room in a way that felt final, but not like an ending, like a shift. As the night began to wind down, your person looked around quietly and said something simple, but meaningful. If there ever came another moment of honesty, they would not waste it the way they had before. They would not hide behind careful words or delayed truth. They would not choose silence when something needed to be expressed. They would choose honesty, and everyone understood exactly what that meant. This wasn't about regret alone anymore. It was about change, because the most powerful realizations rarely arrive loudly. They arrive quietly after long silence, when someone finally stops running from what they already know, and that night was exactly that kind of moment. Even then, it wasn't over. The room fell into silence once more, but this time it felt different. Not empty, not uncertain, just unfinished in a different way. As if one final truth was still waiting to be spoken. Your person sat still, no longer resisting anything. The tension they had carried earlier was gone. What remained was acceptance. One friend finally asked gently if there was still something left unsaid. The question hung there longer than expected. And when your person finally spoke, what they revealed wasn't another emotion, it was a realization. The hardest part was never what they felt, it was how long they had refused to accept it. The delay, the avoidance, the repeated choice to push it aside instead of facing it directly. That was what weighed on them the most. Not the feeling itself, but the time spent pretending it wasn't important. Because there were always chances to be honest, always moments they could have stopped and acknowledged it, always opportunities to face it instead of escaping it. But they didn't. They chose distraction. They chose silence. They chose distance. Because admitting it would have meant accepting how deeply it still mattered. And that truth changed the entire meaning of everything they had said that night. This was not something that appeared suddenly. It had been there all along, hidden beneath routine, beneath conversation, beneath daily life, beneath everything that looked normal on the surface. And now it could no longer stay hidden. Then, just when it seemed like everything had already been revealed, your person began to share something else, something they had never admitted before. They said there were moments when they intentionally avoided certain conversations, not because they didn't care, but because they did.